Kevin Barrett, editor at Veterans Today, joins us. So you have an incident that has happened here in Iran, and the authorities have given assurances, as we just said, to have a thorough investigation done. This was in the past few days that this incident happened. But that doesn't justify the way that some of the demonstrators have displayed themselves on the streets in terms of property being destroyed, ambulances being destroyed, and of course violence breaking out in the form and manner that it did. How do you assess the situation from the demonstrations and the response that Iranian security forces have given so far?
Well, I've been to Iran many times, and one thing I noticed in Iran is that the security forces and authorities are much more relaxed and friendly and easygoing than they are in much of the West. And of course, the worst is the United States, where I get on the airplane to fly to Iran, and I'm lucky if I don't have very grim, nasty people sort of patting me down and groping my most private parts and being very obnoxious about it. Whereas in Iran, they're smiling and they wave you through and stuff. It's probably a little too relaxed, frankly. And likewise, the way that the hijab restrictions are enforced is very, very loose. So the picture we're getting here in the West right now is part of a propaganda operation, and that propaganda operation probably involves manipulating and inciting these rioters. This reminds us of what happened back after former President Ahmadinejad was elected a little over a decade ago, and we had a weaponized color revolution being orchestrated out of the same Langley, Virginia CIA-type forces that overthrew the democratic government under Mossad in 1953. And by now, they've gotten really good at using social media to create rent-a-mobs, a little bit like the rent-a-mobs they created in 1953 to overthrow the Iranian government by way of their bribing mobsters in South Tehran to bring a bunch of thugs and rioters into the streets. And now they can do it through social media. Gene Sharp led the methodology, the study for how to manipulate people and try to get young, disaffected, usually males, to act out their testosterone impulses by manipulating them, by giving them certain kinds of images and cues and signals and symbols through social media. So we have to keep in mind that this is not just purely an internal Iranian affair, that undoubtedly these rioters have been egged on in ways that they're probably even unaware of through advanced public relations or mind control techniques of the kind developed by Edward Bernays through the social media. The U.S. government is putting billions of dollars into these efforts to try to destabilize Iran, and I think we're seeing some of the results.
Well, when you talk about the way that outside interference is working here, it is quite telling in terms of the way that they're using different methodologies to make sure that these demonstrations that just continue. Now, these are not constructive demonstrations, and the rhetoric that is being used from overseas is not towards any type of resolve that would lead to any logical conversations about this or debates about this. We're seeing just violence that is indirectly and in a very discreet but yet smart way being advocated. Many of these demonstrators, some are 14 years old, 15 years old. They don't know any better, and they see what is being fed to them from some of these satellite stations that are backed either directly or indirectly by some of these Western countries, not to mention some of the Arab regimes. So they're being somewhat provoked and then incited to go out on the streets. How is it then that Iran should react to that? Because it leads to really unfortunate instances of injuries, property destruction, and of course the unfortunate incidents of death that has occurred at this point. Which I'm just trying to understand how it is that they're doing this from the outside without there being some condemnation on that, and for them to stop that.
Well, the problem is that the same perpetrators who do this all over the world, the same perpetrators who overthrew the democratically elected government of Ukraine of Yanukovych in 2014 using these kinds of techniques, they whipped up all kinds of unrest and got crowds out on the streets using these patented CIA color revolution techniques. And then once they had the crowds on the streets, they brought in their special forces, their special operators, to hide on rooftops and fire both at police and at crowds, making the crowds think the police were firing on them and whipping them up into hysteria. And that's the same technique that was used to incite the Syrian civil war and destroy the nation of Syria, essentially, as well. They did exactly the same thing. They got the crowds in the streets. They brought in the American and U.S. paid special forces snipers to hide behind the rooftops and fire at the crowds, make the crowds think the police were firing at them, fire at the police, who now think the crowds are firing at them, and start a civil war. This is, they've done it in dozens of countries. The U.S. has overthrown many dozens of governments using these techniques. So the Iranian response to this has to be first, I think, to explain, to put out the truth about this, to repeatedly publicize the methodologies used by the American empire to try to overthrow governments it doesn't like. And then secondly, the response needs to be very flexible, adroit, and to not go too far in one direction or another at any given point. Not to go too far in terms of sort of backing off and letting them riot, or which is what Yanukovych did, or not to go too far in cracking down in ways that can be portrayed as brutal, and indeed often are brutal, as I think happened to some extent in Syria. So there has to be a sort of a fine line, and there has to be a very quick response that's tempered to the circumstances of the moment. But above all, getting the truth out about this is really a challenge. And in the Western media, it's going to get buried. Anybody who wants to learn the truth about this can. They can read books. All kinds of academic books describe how this stuff has been orchestrated all over the world. But the mainstream media makes sure that average people don't know about it. Well, the average people in Iran really need to know about it. It's really important to make sure that they do know about it.
And final question, I say this, but I'm not too sure I should be taken seriously or not based on what the news is, because I almost laughed when I read it, but maybe I shouldn't laugh. And it said that the U.S. has sanctioned Iran's morality police.
No. Well, I guess the poor morality police will no longer be able to invest in New York Stock Exchange, and I'm sure they're all they're crying and whimpering and ready to hoist the white flag of surrender when they heard that news.
Yeah, it's because I mean, when you talk about morality, I don't think the U.S. can really preach or advocate anything on that stage. But the reason why I say I shouldn't really take this in that light, because after all, a woman did die. And again, it's just unfortunate that the West promotes the way that it wants to, as you said, go through this regime change, which it never learns its lesson, that it doesn't really amount to the purposes that they even want. We're going to end it there. Thank you very much, Kevin Barrett, editor at Veterans Today. We appreciate it.